Okay, everyone, why don't we get started? Welcome to our seminar today. I'm Ken Schultz. I'm a professor in the political science department and here at CSAC, and my pleasure to moderate today and introduce our speaker. So Fahd Humayun is a Stanton Nuclear Security Fellow here at CSAC. He completed his PhD in political science from Yale University and then joined Tufts University as assistant professor of political science. His research looks at domestic sources of interstate conflict and crisis behavior, where he thinks about issues of political accountability and representation, how that affects crisis decision-making and signaling. And so he's going to be talking to us today about a piece of his book project, Leaders, Reputation, and War. So take it away, Fahd.
Hi. Thank you, Ken, for that very kind introduction, and thank you to everyone for being here. I'm very grateful for this opportunity to be able to share my book project, which is currently, in the works. I'm about 2/3 of the way done with most of the research and writing, so I feel like this is a really good time to take stock of some of the ideas and see how they land with a specialist audience such as yourself. So to motivate the talk for this afternoon, I want to begin with an anecdote from the first Trump administration. Some of you might recall that very soon into his administration, President Trump authorized the use of force against targets in Syria. Essentially, President Trump was responding to a chemical weapons attack by Assad. Assad had used chemical weapons against Syrian rebels. And Trump said it is in the vital national security interest of the United States to prevent and deter the spread and use of deadly chemical weapons. This is even though in 2013, when President Obama had contemplated using force in response to Assad's use of chemical weapons in Syria, Trump had very clearly signaled his opposition to any kind of intervention. And incidentally, at the time, there was also almost unanimous opposition from Republicans in Congress. Trump at the time was researching a possible presidential run. And so when Obama is thinking about whether or not to sort of use force when Assad uses chemical weapons, Trump, made it very clear where he stood on the question of intervention. So these are a series of tweets that took place between August and September when the United States was considering how best to respond to the situation. So the big question that the book tries to address is, why is it that some elected leaders end up repositioning themselves on salient foreign policy issues? Political science tells us that voters and domestic audiences writ large generally don't like it when they see inconsistency from politicians. So one thing that you might sort of say is, well, isn't this something that all politicians do? They say one thing to get into office, and they come into office and they end up doing something else. But for a number of reasons, I argue that on high-stakes questions of national security, politicians should be particularly disincentivized from being inconsistent, right? Because if you're inconsistent on issues of domestic policy, your audience is largely domestic. When you're inconsistent on foreign policy, you're actually sending signals to your allies and your adversaries about things such as like your trustworthiness, your credibility, your resolve in a crisis, and so on and so forth. And in 2017, when Trump is claiming credit for having responded with decisive force to the use of chemical weapons in Syria, folks like John Bolton are referring to the fact that the United States didn't respond in 2013 as Assad not having learned his lesson. But I think it's also fair to ask, to what extent did Assad anticipate that a Trump administration would actually respond to the use of force, given what Assad's priors about Trump probably were? So in seeking answers to this question, why do elected leaders reposition themselves on salient foreign policy issues, you might conjecture that, well, maybe what happens is that the world changes and leaders simply update their beliefs, right? There's new information, the security environment changes. I think a good example of this is when he was running for president, George W. Bush advocated for a humble foreign policy that would avoid his predecessor's mistakes of overcommitting the US military around the world. But then 9/11 happens, and perhaps we can sort of argue that 9/11 drastically impacted Bush's preferences for using force. The problem is that there's also something that's called the cognitive consistency thesis. And basically, it's this idea that when the world changes, leaders actually prefer to adapt new information to their pre-existing beliefs rather than modifying the beliefs themselves. And so when we look at it from this perspective, I think we might in fact ask, to what extent did Bush end up using 9/11 to corroborate his pre-existing beliefs about certain leaders and certain countries in the world? And furthermore, I think it's safe to say that events like 9/11 are thankfully rare. The world doesn't always change that dramatically. And so for these reasons, I think it's plausible to say that the underlying beliefs and preferences that leaders have ought to be fundamentally stable, right? And if they're stable, then issue repositioning on these high stakes questions of foreign policy should be relatively rare. But the historical record actually suggests otherwise. So if we look at Israel, in 1977, Israel elects Menachem Begin as a prime minister. At the time, the Carter administration is very sort of apprehensive because they see Begin as being intractable on the issue of exchanging land for peace. And yet Begin actually, one of the first things he undertakes once he comes into office is he starts moving forward to negotiate a lasting peace with Egypt. We can also look at more recently at the case of India, where a known hardliner, Prime Minister Modi, comes to power in 2014. And one of the very first things he does is he reaches out with a hand of friendship to arch rival Pakistan. In 2016, when Moon Jae-in is running for president in South Korea, he actually campaigns on this platform of opposing the deployment of a terminal high altitude area defense system on the Korean peninsula. He says this is bad for, this will be destabilizing for the region. But just before the election, he makes an about turn and ends up not only advocating for those deployments, but once he comes into office, he actively pursues those deployments. So, the sum and substance of this is that Donald Trump really isn't alone in terms of leaders who reposition themselves on these salient foreign policy issues. What I argue in the book is essentially this: leaders reposition themselves on salient foreign policy issues on account of something which I call reputation management. And this is essentially what reputation management is. It's the strategic calibration by leaders of where they would like to be seen as standing on a high salience issue. So to put this into perspective, we can think of there being some distribution of leaders who prefer the use of force, right? So hawkish leaders versus those who believe in the value of diplomacy and negotiation, dovish leaders. To identify those preferences, we look at leader reputation, right? Reputation is essentially the beliefs or opinions that we hold about someone else. In an ideal world, these things should track pretty closely. So a dovish leader should have a dovish reputation and a hawkish leader should have a hawkish reputation. The problem here, however, is that preferences are fundamentally unobservable, right? We can't actually look into the minds of leaders and know whether they prefer using force or whether they prefer to be more peaceful. What we do observe, however, are statements and actions, the things that leaders say and the things that they do. And it's essentially based on those statements and actions that we leaders have reputations. I think it's also fair to say that leaders are fundamentally strategic actors with powerful incentives to either maintain their reputation, right? So if I'm a dovish leader, I want to say dovish things and have a dovish reputation. If I'm a hawkish leader, I should say hawkish things and have a hawkish reputation. But leaders, I argue, can also have incentives to moderate their reputations, right? So I might be a dovish leader, but I want to present as hawkish, and I might be a hawkish leader, and I want to present as dovish. So what exactly are those incentives, right? Why would leaders want to sort of moderate their reputations to present themselves as being something that they're not? And so the first thing that I want to introduce here is something that's many people have already written about. It's something that's called a moderation imperative. Voters are actually quite wary of leaders who hold extreme positions on war and peace. And so leaders who do hold extreme positions on war and peace know that they stand to earn a credibility and a credibility dividend if they end up taking a middle of the road position for the sake of the greater national good, right? It sort of gets to this idea that it's easier for doves to make war and it's easier for hawks to make peace, and it takes a Richard Nixon to go to China. But this then begs the question, why don't we see this all the time, right? If there's a credibility dividend to be earned from moderating your reputation and taking a middle of the road position, why don't doves behave hawkishly? And why don't hawks behave dovishly all of the time? So in the book, I argue that there are two kinds of leaders who are likely to be especially susceptible to a moderation imperative. So the first are those leaders who are actually suffering from a credibility deficit on national security at a time when changes in the security environment are powerfully impacting the public audience's preferences for a hawkish leader or a dovish leader. Inexperience, right, military inexperience or political inexperience can be a good proxy for, somebody who has a credibility deficit, but it's not the only explanation for it. So as an example, in the 2016 election, Hillary Clinton was clearly the more experienced foreign policy candidate, but decisions that were taken around sort of intervention in Libya, Benghazi, the fact that Hillary Clinton had voted for the war in Iraq, are actually used very effectively by the opposition to sort of cast Clinton as a candidate who lacked credibility. In contrast, Donald Trump, in some ways, was more inexperienced, but had more credibility because of his message of sort of reducing the military's footprint overseas and putting America first. The second kind of leader who I argue should be susceptible to a moderation imperative is the pragmatist leader, right? A leader who isn't idealistically or ideologically wedded to a certain policy issue. It should be easier for such leaders to actually move away from their ideal point and to be flexible. And conversely, the kinds of leaders who then shouldn't moderate should be those who are, number one, secure in their national security credentials, and number two, idealist type leaders with strong ideological commitments on a given policy issue. So I want to walk through some examples. And again, going back to the example of Menachem Begin, who was elected as prime minister in 1977, I want to use Begin as the example of a leader who doesn't moderate because of a low moderation imperative. And this is the first kind of reputation management strategy that I want to introduce, which is follow-through behavior. Essentially, Begin comes into office advocating for greater defense preparedness and advocating for a tougher, stronger preemptive defense policy. And when it becomes clear in 1980 that Saddam Hussein is getting closer to having an operational nuclear reactor, Begin gives the go-ahead for the IAF to strike the reactor and to take it out. Now, in this instance, I argue that Begin is actually just simply following through on things that he's already signaled before coming into office. And the reason why he has a low moderation imperative is because by the time 1981 rolls around, he's already significantly bolstered his national security credentials by having delivered a peace with Egypt. It helps that in the security cabinet decision to take that takes this decision, there are hardliners and folks with military experience who also endorse the decision to strike Iraq. I also argue that on this particular issue, Begin is actually more of an idealist, right? Because he has very strong ideological convictions about preemptive defense, about security. He's willing to risk the fact that this operation eventually leads to partial embargoes and delays in shipments of American weapons to Israel. There's evidence from this in this memo from Reagan's national security advisor that the United States was also very much aware of Begin's thinking on Iraq's nuclear program, including his determination to use force if diplomacy failed to eliminate the Iraqi nuclear threat. So I want to contrast Begin's behavior in 80-81 and the decision to strike the nuclear reactor with his behavior at Camp David in 1979, when we see a very different Begin, a Begin who's willing to sign a historic peace agreement with Egypt that includes pulling out Israeli forces from the Sinai Peninsula. Now, in this case, I argue that Begin actually had a higher moderation imperative. So to begin with, Begin is in fact not ideologically wedded to the Sinai Peninsula in the same way he is to the West Bank, which he sees as being part of Greater Israel. And there's this, he's aware that he doesn't want external pressure that might suggest that he should be flexible on the regions that he considers part of Judea Samaria. He in fact signals this flexibility much earlier on than Camp David. So even when he's trying to persuade Moshe Dayan into his cabinet as foreign minister, Moshe Dayan writes in his biography, I told the prime minister that I would consider this if you could reassure me then and there on two policy issues. The first concerned the limits of Israeli sovereignty, and Begin clarified these points to Dayan's satisfaction. Begin's biographers also note that Begin had in the past privately acknowledged his willingness to return the Sinai. So again, we see these indications of flexibility and pragmatism. And I think it's also important to remember that Begin is somebody who is acutely conscious of his reputation when he comes into office. So this is somebody who's been in the opposition for 29 years. And I thought this was very interesting. The extent to which the criticism that he faced in the foreign media ended up actually bothering him. So he would ask his advisor, well, what have they written about me in English today? He would routinely ask Kadeshai at the start of his first term, and the reply would cause him to cry out in protest. He was used to critical editorials in Israeli newspapers, but the stream of invectives against him overseas, which focused on his past, pained him, to the point where he even considered sending his Minister of Information on a public relations tour of the United States to sort of soften his image. And Avi Shalom, who's written a biography of Begin, writes, precisely because of the concerns expressed in the foreign media over his extremism, Begin regards a breakthrough in foreign policy to be his most important mission. So the reason why I like to sort of start with Begin is because I think this is an interesting sort of example of within case variation, where the same leader deploys two different reputation management strategies in response to two different policy issues. So the next question that this leads to, which is that, okay, so it's clear that leaders sometimes have an incentive to moderate, but when should we expect them to do this? And this is where I argue that there are two logics of reputation management. The first is an electoral logic. So a leader needs to enhance their credibility to either attain or to retain office. and to appeal to the median voter who's most likely to be a moderate. So if in this situation, we can imagine a leader's term as being bounded by an election that brings them into office and then re-election, which might keep them in office, we should expect reputation moderation to take place immediately before an election, right? That's when leaders who have a high moderation imperative should try to attenuate their reputations in order to sort of bolster their credentials. So an example of attenuating behavior that I'd like to use is that of Richard Nixon in 1971. So 1971 isn't a very good year for Nixon because the United States is sort of, it's rocked by anti-war protests. And Nixon's policy of Vietnamization in the Vietnam War is proving to, at best, have mixed results. And there's this general sense that Nixon needs other victories to prevent the war from becoming an election issue in 1972. And so that July in 1971, Nixon, a known anti-communist hardliner, will announce his intention to visit China, and that October, he'll announce his intention to visit the Soviet Union. So the New York Times picks up on this and they say, well, some cynics explain that Mr. Nixon, realizing that he is in political trouble, is visiting China for the sole purpose of guaranteeing his re-election. But the Times also sort of observes that if he can monopolize the peace issue by this visit, his enemies will be left vulnerable before the electorate on matters of both war and peace. So to be clear, what I'm not arguing is that Nixon is in trouble in Vietnam, and so there's a switch that flips and he becomes a dove overnight, because I think the forces that are pushing towards détente, they're on the cards even early in his term. But the argument that I make in the book is the announcements in 1971 that this is what I plan to do were in fact highly strategic. So Kissinger, for instance, in his memoir, writes that Nixon, in fact, wanted the Soviet summit to take place as early as 1970, before the congressional election. And there's other interesting stuff here that Nixon says. He tells Kissinger, let me tell you something interesting. I put a question in the poll taken over the weekend. This is in October 1970. These are the number of people who would favor a summit meeting. And he says, the point is, with those kinds of numbers, it shows you how this kind of announcement made a week before can have a great effect. And if you look at the conversations that Nixon and Kissinger have, it becomes even more illuminating in June 1971. July is when Nixon announces the decision to go to China. So Kissinger says, I think it would help if we can afford it. It would help you post your best through 72 if you can be seen as having moved deliberately but decisively. Nixon says, we're going to have to make some play showing that Nixon's still in the arena. And I think this is really interesting. Nixon says, if we didn't have an election coming up next year, he goes on to say, and we have to play to the galleries, we're up against the Kennedys, the Muskies, and the rest, panting to get over there, and knowing the left with all their rhetoric, and so on and so forth. And it's quite clear that Nixon is aware of his reputation as a hardliner. So in fact, he tells the Soviet premier when he meets him in 1972, he says, I have a reputation as a hardline anti-communist. And the Soviet prime minister says, we know. And clearly the New York Times and other media outlets are also aware of this. They shower him with praise for these visits, and Nixon sees approval ratings go up in response to both trips. So this is the second kind of behavior that I suggest, which leaders can engage in. It's attenuating behavior, right? Leaders know that they have a certain reputation and they try and attenuate on that reputation for electoral gain. So this is an example of leaders who have a high moderation imperative. But if you recall, at the beginning, I spoke about leaders sometimes having a moderation imperative and sometimes actually not having a moderation imperative. So how should we expect leaders with a low moderation imperative to behave just before an election? And here the argument I make is that if a leader is already gaining credibility from their reputation, then prior to being held accountable by the electorate, leaders should actually double down on that reputation and accentuate that reputation. And I think a good example of accentuating behavior not to be confused with attenuating behavior, is that of Shimon Peres, who calls for early elections in 1996 in Israel. So Peres becomes prime minister after his predecessor, Rabin, is assassinated in 1995 by a right-wing opponent of the Oslo peace process. So Rabin is assassinated in 95, and until February 96, support for peace in Israel is at an all-time high. And Peres, who has a dovish reputation, is hoping to cash in on this, and in February announces early election. And up till May, which is when the elections are, he actively continues to push for implementing the Oslo Accords. So Peres has a low moderation imperative in this instance, because I argue, number one, he's very much ideologically committed to the question of peace. He's seen by many as being even more left than Rabin was, and is seen as having been the architect of Oslo. And Peres, at Rabin's funeral, addresses Israel's Arab neighbors saying, neither I nor you are allowed to stop nor postpone nor hesitate on the road to a full and comprehensive peace. And it's also clear that he sees a consistency dividend based on what the polls are saying in terms of after Rabin is assassinated, most of the Israeli public is on board with this, and they want to see a peace with the Palestinians work out. So this is another quote from Time. At the time, to win the election, Peres must take advantage of his current high standing. Another peace deal would make him a shoo-in. This is in contrast to, simultaneously, Peres's behavior vis-a-vis Hezbollah and Lebanon just before the election. So while Peres is trying to implement Oslo with the Palestinians, he launches Operation Grapes of Wrath against Hezbollah following rocket attacks that claim many Israeli casualties. And it's clear that after each series of rocket attacks, the Israeli public is indicating a growing shift to the right. So why does Peres do this? Here, I'd argue that Peres actually has a high moderation imperative. So in an interview that I conducted at the end of last year, this idea was suggested that Peres had never served in the Israeli military and felt guilty as a consequence, and tries to overcompensate for that by playing his hand with this operation so close to the election. And it also seems as if the Americans are aware of this. Right? Peres has a reputation for softness on security, and he faces a nasty election fight with the hawkish Benjamin Netanyahu. The US supports Peres, who has led the peace process, and it essentially gives him a green light to burnish this image of toughness. So that's an example of the electoral logic of reputation management playing out. But then this leads us to ask, right? If we expect leaders to moderate later in their term, how should we expect leaders to behave earlier in their term? Right? If we think about things from the perspective of an electoral logic, it stands to reason that earlier in your term, you actually behave in a way that's more in line with your true preferences, right? Because after all, one of the main sort of motivations for running for office is for you to be able to implement your preferred policies. But in the book, I argue that leaders can also moderate early in their term, but they do so for a different logic. And this is a policy implementation logic, right? If a leader knows that they need to enhance their credibility or legitimacy with a policy constituency to be able to implement their preferred policies, then we're likely to see this kind of moderation earlier in a leader's term. So this is an example of concessionary behavior, right? This is the last reputation management strategy that I'll talk about. And the example that I want to use is President Obama's decision to surge troops in Afghanistan in 2009. So President Obama comes into office, a decision has to be made about, what do we do in the war in Afghanistan? And Obama is under considerable pressure from his generals, from his Secretary of Defense, to surge as many as 40,000 troops. This is even though Obama is somebody whose political rise has been on the backs of having opposed forever wars. Carter Malkasian, who's written a great book on the Afghanistan war, says Obama's embrace of Afghanistan actually contrasts with his worldview. he was wary of pouring more US blood and treasure into military interventions, and he was deeply disapproving of Bush's foreign policy. So here I argue that Obama actually has a high moderation imperative, right? Because Obama eventually gives in to the military's demand for sending troops. But I argue that Obama is actually acutely conscious of how his national security credentials are viewed when he arrives in office. So in his memoir, he says, "My hyperactive chief of staff knew that this new liberal president couldn't afford to look soft on terrorism." This is something that Leon Panetta seems to pick up on. He writes, "Obama was a new president, a Democrat without military experience. For him to defy his military advisors on a matter so central to the success of his foreign policy, and note this, and so early in his presidency, would have represented an almost impossible risk." And what I argue is that Obama shows a high level of pragmatism even before he takes a decision on the surge, right? And this is best, I think, captured by his decision to keep on Bob Gates as his Secretary of Defense. And this is the justification that Obama provides. He says Gates was a Republican, a Cold War hawk, a card-carrying member of the national security establishment. Right? And he says, as with my economic appointments, my reasons were practical. We can see a very sort of pragmatic kind of Obama thinking about what he needs to do to get the job done. I think another sort of indication of his pragmatism is that in the bigger picture, foreign policy was actually secondary to domestic policy for Obama, because he comes into office, the Great Recession is at hand, the economy is falling apart. He's very sort of invested in getting Obamacare through. And this quote, which Arzan, thanks a lot for refreshing my memory on this, Malkasian writes that Obama in 2008 said that the job of the president is to think broadly, not narrowly, and to weigh the costs and benefits of military action with everything else that's going on. He also tells his National Security Council, "I think I have 2 years with the public on this. They'll stand with us for 2 years on Afghanistan. That's my window," right? A window for his domestic priorities to come to fruition. And in exchange for sort of conceding his position, I think it's also important to remember that Obama is able to wrangle key concessions in that decision to surge troops. So he doesn't send 40,000 troops, he sends 30,000 troops, and he's also able to get a stipulated withdrawal timeline. This is the fourth example of a reputation management strategy. This is concessionary behavior. So the book, sort of talks about the logic that leaders can have to engage in reputation management, right? So leaders can either be driven by a policy implementation strategy, or they can logic, or they can be driven by an election-winning logic, right? And underneath both of these logics, leaders can either moderate their reputations, as Obama did on Afghanistan and as Nixon did by going to China and the Soviet Union, or they can maintain their reputations, as Begin does when he strikes Iraq's nuclear reactor, and as Shimon Peres does as he pushes to implement Oslo so close to the election. So I've only presented this talk once before, and the first question that I got was, well, this is really interesting, but can you tell us what this means for President Trump, and can you tell us how is Trump going to behave going forward? And I honestly didn't have a good answer to the question at the time, but I've thought about this question since, and I think when you consider Trump's psychological profile, I think he's actually somebody who should be quite susceptible to a moderation imperative. There are a couple of reasons for this. Number one, we know that Trump isn't idealistically wedded to any one policy position, right? He has an enormous capacity to deviate from his ideal point. And sort of slapping Canada and Mexico with tariffs is a good example of this, even though his administration negotiated this in his first term. In contrast, I would argue somebody like Joe Biden is actually more sort of less pragmatic, more idealistically wedded to issues, right? Biden's decision to go through with the withdrawal from Afghanistan, even though it had to take place in very difficult circumstances, is an indication of that inability to sort of move away from your ideal point. Secondly, I think when he first came into office, Trump was actually pretty sensitive to the fact that he was a national security outsider, right? So we know that he routinely dismissed his generals and didn't take their advice. I think he did so out of a position of insecurity. He didn't like to be challenged on an issue that he actually felt very insecure about. So what he was very good at doing was curating a tough guy image, but then he really hankered for the dividend that came from moderating that image, right? Be it with came in North Korea or elsewhere. So I think the big question for Trump's second term is, how is he going to behave? This is clearly a president who will be thinking about his legacy. He hopefully doesn't face, is not looking at re-election. But the big question really is, are we expecting to see a president who engages in bluster, followed by a transformational but winnable war? Or are we going to see a leader who will engage in bluster, followed by a transformational peace? And I say a winnable war here because I don't think an unwinnable war is something that Trump is going to be attractive for Trump. For those reasons, I actually think Trump is going to be very cautious on the question of China. Iran, on the other hand, or another kind of smaller regional conflict, I think is something that could be very attractive for Trump. And I think it's also very clear that Trump really hankers for the Nobel Peace Prize. He's been nominated for this 4 times already. It clearly bothers him that this is something that Obama has and he doesn't. And for these reasons, I think there should be an incentive for some moderation here. The not so good news is that President Trump is currently a very strong president, right? So there'll be a limited applicability of the policy implementation logic, where you concede your position in order to sort of curry favor with your opponents. There's also, I think, this risk that he may now feel sufficiently secure in his national security credentials, having served as president for 1 term already. So I think the thing to remember is that Trump essentially has 4 years, and so he has at least the first 2 years to pick winnable fights before turning into a peacemaker to make that turn, to make that pivot even more dramatic, right? Even more sort of surprising. So I thank you. I'm going to end here, but thank you so much for listening. I look forward to your thoughts and questions.
Thank you for that presentation. So we have good time for questions here. Just logistics here. People online can put questions into the Q&A. I will be monitoring that. People in the room, we can do the 1 finger, 2 finger. By tradition, we're going to start with some CSAC fellows to get throughout the first few pitches, and then we'll extend. So I see Brandon and Patrick.
Right. Thank you for the talk. So I have 2 questions. The first is regarding the argument and prediction about leader type and whether they engage in moderation imperative. So it seems that the prediction about pragmatists are going to flip-flop and idealists are more inflexible is risking a little bit being tautological. They are true by definition in a way. The second question is in the Nixon 1971 case, I wonder to what extent this is a case of moderation imperative or just leader responding to a dovish domestic public opinion, right? So in a counterfactual case, when we have a left-wing or more dovish president, shouldn't we expect them to engage in a similar type of behavior?
Good question. Yeah. Thanks, X. Good questions. And I should sort of preface by saying that all these questions, I'm taking this as feedback because there are a lot of things that I'm also still working through right now. On the Nixon 71 behaving dovishly in response to a dovish public, that's the question, right? And that a dovish president would have behaved the same. Yeah, I mean, I think that's fair to say. I think what I'm sort of, what the book hopefully will argue is that not necessarily making the claim again that people sort of change overnight and behave a certain way, but it's that the decisions that they undertake are motivated, are rarely unicausal, and so one of the things that impacts those decisions is the imperatives that leaders face, and with some of the material in the Nixon case, I think it's quite compelling to see this idea that he's actually very cognizant of ceding space to the left on these issues, and the extent to which he's thinking about the election is in 72. First in 70, the midterm, and then 72, I think is pretty remarkable. Your first point is well taken. I think what I'm trying to do in the book is to show that either pragmatism or idealism, evidence of that can sort of be shown up front before leaders actually take decisions on that issue, right? So we're not making these inferences based on the fact that leaders do something and then we say, okay, this is clearly an idealistic leader.
Yeah, I just want to second what X said and amplify it a little bit. First, so you have these trade-offs, right, between these differing imperatives. And so I do wonder, like X does, about the falsifiability. You know, what determines the trade-off between the consistency benefit that you mentioned at the outset versus the moderation benefit, right? You didn't really grapple with that. You only talked about the moderation benefit. What's the trade-off between the policy and electoral imperatives, right? And you can see in some of your 2x2s, right, you can make either prediction depending on the balance of those variables, which you didn't really theorize. And so I do wonder about the falsifiability of the theory as X did. More broadly, I wonder, you seem to have a static theory or a dynamic puzzle. The puzzle is, why do leaders flip-flop? But your variables are you secure in your national security credentials, and are you ideologically committed? Right? Those are sort of intrinsic qualities of the politician. And so the question is, why would we ever see somebody who's not secure and who is ideologically flexible? Why would they ever take a non-moderate position to begin with, right? Why do we see flip-flopping when they should have adopted a moderate position from the very beginning, given who they are as a politician?
So can I start with the second one? I think the answer to this is in some ways has to do with the nature of democratic competition, and this when leaders try to build a base and they try to sort of make the contrast between them and their political opponent as stark as possible. In that process, they end up sort of, they end up signaling that they have either extreme preferences either for war or for peace, because that's likely what the opponent is doing as well. They start converging on these issues, then there's less of a difference, I think. And so in some ways, I think this is also a product of democratic competition. But what happens is that when leaders know that they're going to be held account on those positions, that's when we see the moderation actually kicking in. So it's very easy for leaders to sort of make sweeping kinds of statements and to claim like they occupy either a certain end of the spectrum. In some ways, that's what posturing is. But then the consequences of that posturing, I think, become costly when leaders are either need to get things done, need to get policy implemented, or they need to sort of retain office. And they know that, well, maybe people didn't like the fact that I took such an extreme position.
Yeah.
Maybe one way to say it is that I'm going to take another moderate position again, not news, but changing my position is news. And in an election cycle, especially, that's what.
This connects, I think, to the first question, which was there's this other variable, which is in maybe inconsistency costs. And it does seem like maybe you're conjecturing here that those are not very large generally relative to the moderation incentives. Is that what you were getting at with your first question?
Yeah, it seems a little bit under theorized in how these variables interact with each other, and what you said in your response wasn't in your theory at all. I don't know if that's just for the talk, but if it's not in the book, it definitely should be in the book. Some explanation for why you would start with a non-moderate position when your incentives are to moderate.
Yeah.
Your response wasn't quite fulfilling because Ken's written about you. How often you want to pool on a particular policy if that policy is popular, right? Why would I want to distinguish myself by taking a position that's less popular than my opponents? So I'm not sure. So, and this gets to what X is saying, right? Are you just responding to public opinion? Are you moderating when public opinion tells you to moderate? So I understand your response, but I'm not sure I find it completely satisfying. Yeah.
Thank you. That's helpful.
So, Patrick Hume, CSEC Fellows here. So, what couple things I was wondering the whole time, well, I guess one main thing and then one more specific thing. So you kind of got it at this a bit, but I was wondering the whole time about really how, independent of these other factors, there's kind of incentives to act hawkish at the beginning of your term and to open some room later on to be a little bit more dovish, kind of regardless of who you are. So you kind of gave the example of Obama, who was kind of in there. This famously happens with Reagan. Like Nixon, you can make that argument. And you'll see this a lot where there's a new president, for example, in the US, their first crisis, the news is saying, oh, everyone wants to see how they're gonna, how tough they are, how they're gonna react. You know this literature better than I do. My understanding is there's been maybe a little bit honest. I think like Daniel Lupton's book, she talks about this a bit, how leaders have incentives to act a little bit tougher earlier in their term. It seems like this is kind of tied in with your story, but I was just kind of wondering about that the whole time. Like, could even just that, independent of whether they're an idealist or pragmatist, whatever, because just those incentives act tougher at the beginning, trying to establish kind of this reputation for toughness, and then like, give some room later on if you're Nixon or Reagan or maybe an Obama. Would that do some explaining? And actually, I started thinking of this when you were talking about the Syria example at the beginning, where I was thinking you have Obama's kind of later, he's in his second term by 2013. And so maybe he has more wiggle room to say, look, my reputation's already established now. I don't want to intervene. I'm not going to intervene. Whereas if you're Trump, it's his first crisis, right? It's April, I think, 2017. Then it might be, even though from his personal preferences, which you showed from the tweets, even it was, I don't want to intervene. But if now it's like, no, this is my first crisis, I need to show I'm tough, is that having an effect? So just one thing I was curious about. It kind of seemed like it was related to what you were talking about. So I don't think it's necessarily an issue. It might be worth highlighting. It seems like you kind of had that operating in the background a bit. Then the second one more specifically was on whether we can really abstract away from like the individual cases themselves, what's going on in the case. Let me give you a perfect example. So you're talking about in 72, for example, Nixon, and certainly vis-a-vis China, the Soviet Union, he's doing all these accommodating things, as you're highlighting. At the same time, in Vietnam, it's complete opposite. He starts Operation Linebacker 2, and if anything, it's completely opposite. It's huge ramp up in bombing. It's a lot of domestic outcry, but he's very, very clearly trying to show I'm tough, clearly being very, very hawkish at this exact same time that he's doing these more conciliatory things with the Soviet Union. Because these are at the same time, we can't explain the difference between these two just by saying, well, it's closer to election, because they're both close to election. Wouldn't the alternative explanation just be that, to get things done, sometimes you need to compromise, and other times you just need to, bomb the hell out of them. And they're going to do whatever they think is going to essentially get the job done, whether it's dovish or hawkish. Is there any way to kind of account for that?
Good questions. Thanks. So one, I think, on to the second question, comment, I think the book sort of makes this, allows for this, which is that leaders can deploy different reputation management strategies simultaneously in different arenas. And I think the issue I think the way that the Nixon case is looking is that there was this imperative to sort of prevent Vietnam from becoming an election issue in 1972. And the way to do that was to sort of change the headlines and sort of like get, these other things into the news, which doesn't necessarily require a change in position on Vietnam itself, because the attempt is to sort of distract or public attention from that. But the case of Shimon Peres as well is an example of that, because while he's pursuing peace with the Palestinians, he's simultaneously launching a military operation against Hezbollah and Lebanon. So Perez the hawk and Perez the dove are very much acting in tandem, but on different sort of areas. And first point taken. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, Paul.
First, I want to compliment you on this talk. I thought it was extraordinarily clear and well argued and just beautifully presented. So excellent. Thank you. My question is, one of the things I loved about the talk was all the quotations from memoirs and even the Nixon tapes, where you have people directly talking about their strategic goals for whatever decision they're going to make. I wonder, just kind of out of curiosity, how you would think about Kamala Harris's position on Gaza during the election. Because she was trying to walk this tightrope and say, I'm for both sides in this, war. And so she's trying to maintain and moderate at the same time. And, I don't think that's why she lost the election, but I am curious about situations like that where there's no good way out for the leader.
Thank you. I think, in Harris's case, my sense is that distancing herself from Biden sufficiently, but not over distancing herself, was really the trap that she struggled with. And I think with there was an extra imperative to sort of appear tough, even more so. I think there's a gendered sort of aspect there where she couldn't afford to look weak. But she was also cognizant of the criticism that the Biden administration had faced on this issue, and she didn't want to sort of be burnt by that. And so it was a very difficult, I think, thing to do, which she tried to do, and there was really no, I don't think there was any good sort of outcome there for her.
Yeah, and in the back there, I'm sorry, I don't know your name.
I have a question, well, a couple questions, and it's more about just layering additional aspects to your research. It would be including financial gain, which we've seen, especially since the takeover, where historically in 2011 or 12, or sorry, 2001 or 2, when Bush was not initially as hawkish as he wound up being, and a lot of that was because of the motivations of Cheney, who wanted to monopolize and incentivize the war abroad, and was able to utilize that and then basically turn the government into an agency that paid large corporations, including the one that we're currently sitting above, conference room, into funding wars abroad. And so how does that motivate people through economic gain? But then also the new rise of what we think we may be seeing with Trump and Putin, which is empire building, and the legacies of empire building in taking away nation states and going back to the age of empires. So with like the war in Ukraine, with Putin starting that in order to gain more territory and take land. So those two as factors into your research and how that might motivate leaders into how they act and respond to crisis.
And sorry, just the first question was about financial
gain. So initially, if I remember the war correctly, I was currently dating someone who actually worked for Bechtel at the time, and we were notified of the opportunity to go to Iraq for him well before the war was declared. And so we were shown that there was going to be a huge financial gain to do that. And then when the news came out that they were going to go to Iraq, despite knowing that the bombers had been currently housed in Afghanistan and they were seeing other people abroad, other areas that wasn't Iraq, and then with the information that came out. So how does the privatization of military and also rebuilding countries, which Bechtel got and then subcontracted to companies like Halliburton and KBR, how does that motivate people? Because Cheney was part of that. And that's what motivated Bush in a lot of regards to change his stances. At least that's how the general public has been told that. And then with the new rise of empire building, it's all makes sense. How does money work in this?
I think
People seem very motivated by money.
Those are good questions. They're very big questions. I mean, so on the money aspect, or I think what it speaks to would be how you conceptualize hawkishness and dovishness and the factors that are either innately inherent to you that make you hawkish or dovish on the use of force, or are those things that can be actually shaped by external variables, perhaps. But I think we can also think of hawkishness and dovishness as existing independently of, say, extractive incentives that leaders might have, which could be a byproduct of using force. It could make them, there could be a capitalist angle to that. I don't know if that's a satisfying answer, but they're both good questions.
If I could just build on one part of that question, it raised this issue about advisors and your other bureaucratic actors and how they play in this.
Yeah, I think this is probably one area where I need to sort of maybe I need to streamline this argument a little more clearly, which is who is the domestic audience that you are essentially pandering to or posturing to. So the electoral logic would suggest that it's basically the people who vote for you and you want to sort of get back into office. The policy implementation logic would be that no, it's actually people around you, your advisors, your people in Congress, for instance, who you're trying to sort of, you're having to sort of negotiate with. So in the Obama case, for instance, there are people within his own cabinet who differ with him on the question of what to do with Afghanistan, and he has to sort of be very careful in how he sort of negotiates his position, even with his advisors and people who are close to him.
You can speak a little, I cannot hear.
I will. Yeah. Thank you.
Michael.
Really great talk also. Yeah, this is super interesting. I have a question that's kind of related to, I guess, partly the scope of the argument, and also motivated by a bit at the end where you talk about tariffs and things, because I think it seems to me that it doesn't need to be scoped around national security. You could easily apply this to like things around bargaining on economic agreements and things like that. And what that raised a question in my mind that I didn't really see as much in the talk, but I thought would be important for something about reputation on foreign policy issues, is the role of like the reputation of maybe the state or as a corporate entity, that the leader might also have to consider when they're engaging in, certainly they have certain policy preferences that depend on how their international partners are going to respond to them. And so I was thinking about it particularly with trade, where you have the US that has, this long history of being pro-free trade, like very insignificant domestic interest groups that are powerful and have an interest in maintaining the US's stance on those types of issues. And so you might, Trump in that kind of situation or some other leader might have an incentive to kind of accentuate their opposition to that kind of foreign policy as a way to counteract the reputation that might make a threat feel less credible when it's coming from a country that has the reputation of like the United States on free trade or something like that.
Yeah, that's both good questions. To the first point, I think, yeah, sure. The example of tariffs, it might not be explicitly a national security issue, but it's definitely a high salience foreign policy issue, which has the potential to be securitized very quickly, or it's sort of, so I think that's a good. Pomps or subsumes national reputation, but you could have cases where I think leaders with more moderate reputations, the reputation of the state is allowed to take precedence. Where I think this theory sort of operates is where leaders have extreme preferences for war or peace, in a way that then becomes a reflection of which mirrors then the state's reputation in some way, or the state's reputation then mirrors the leader's reputation.
I have a question in the chat, and then I'll come to you. So this is from Damon Coletta, who was our speaker last week. So I'm just going to just summarize the question. Is essentially you seem to be assuming that there's a lot of room for leaders to maneuver, but what role does the structure play here? That is, they're inhabiting an international system that imposes all sorts of structure. We kind of think about that as the kind of an important constraint on leader maneuverability. And so is this a theory that kind of operates on the seams of structural constraints, or is it something that you assume that those constraints are not very binding?
Yeah. Thank you. Really good question. And so here I think, in a crisis, they can often be like a security crisis in which leaders are forced to behave certain ways, right? So regardless of whether you're dovish or hawkish, sorry, I don't know why this is echoing. But regardless of whether you're dovish or hawkish, the external security situation dictates that you would essentially behave the same way. Maybe it demands a certain response. So I think for if we talk about like war or extreme crises, those are areas where structure would probably limit the amount of space that leaders would have to maneuver. The less acute the crisis, probably more agency for leaders to do something that they might not have intended to do otherwise.
Fahd, great talk. Chris Jin, one of the military fellows this year. I just wanted to ask, have you looked at any historical cases? In the military, we always say that the enemy gets a vote. So when we're talking about these democratic leaders, have you seen any instances where adversary states would use this timing to their advantage to challenge a leader's reputation, further in their administration and take advantage of those opportunities to back them into a corner or to make them act in a way that is, that is more predictive for the enemy. If Al Qaeda had waited until September of 2004, as opposed to early in the Bush term, or if China wants to make a move against Taiwan, are they going to do it in the first 2 years of the Trump administration, or will they wait until the legacy is on the line and hope that there wouldn't be less response from a leader who is trying to protect his legacy?
Really good question, and I think absolutely. I mean, I'm off the top of my head, and maybe there are other examples that people can think of, better examples. But in the case of India, Pakistan, before Modi comes to power, there is in fact a trade deal that's being negotiated between India and Pakistan, and the Pakistanis delay the trade deal because they know that there's an election in India, and they're hoping that a more robust administration will be able to sort of lead to a more viable an agreement that wouldn't be then challenged by a strong opposition. And so I can completely see why adversarial countries would keep an eye on the domestic politics of your country. Although in security situations, I think, sometimes, again, if it's a question of structure and a crisis is already playing out, then perhaps that becomes a little less salient, or maybe it's salient for different reasons. Thank you.
Questions? Yeah.
I don't know if this is really a two-finger, but just as you guys were talking, the possible counterfactual to your framework occurred to me, which is Bill Clinton, Somalia. Here is a very young president, known and widely criticized for having no national security credentials, who, as soon as the Mogadishu battle happened, in the first year of his term, decided to pull troops out of Somalia, which I think prima facie goes against what you would say.
But before that, they had escalated themselves into that.
Correct. Yeah. So maybe, but it's something for you to think about.
Thank you. I honestly, I mean, I've looked at Clinton's intervention in Bosnia as a case, but I haven't looked at Somalia, and I can definitely do that.
Yeah.
The Clinton case is interesting because of, number one, the number of overseas commitments that take place under Clinton, and also how he postures with respect to each one of them. He's either hawkish or dovish, or hawkish or dovish. So it's actually quite an interesting sort of period to look at. Thank you.
Also interesting because of course, he inherited that operation from Bush. So it's just an interesting counterfactual as to whether he would have gone into Somalia in the absence of that, of having inherited it. I have a question I know that you've thought about, but give you an opportunity to reflect on here, which is, does this work? Does this strategy actually fool people? Because there's something kind of transparent about it in a sense of that you could kind of see, oh, you're think it's pretty obvious why you're doing this. Why should people take this seriously? So I'm wondering what you think about that.
I think I mean there are cases where certainly leaders do this, and either the opposition or the public calls them out. So Moon Jae-in in South Korea, for instance, is criticized quite vociferously for flip-flopping on the issue of THAAD deployments, for sort of being opposed to them and then supporting them, but then delaying the deployments, but then pursuing the deployments. And he's also criticized from people within his own sort of party for this sort of inconsistency. So I think it's clear to people when this is being done. But in the case of Nixon, I mean, with the China visits and the Soviet visit, they I think bedazzle everybody so much that even the opposition is very much sort of saying this was the right thing, especially when the SALT I ABM treaty is signed. So that I think depending on the success of the policy, whether the policy is successful or not, that I think could really determine the extent to which you're opening yourself up for criticism domestically.
Other questions? We should say thank you very much for an interesting.
Thank you.